Welcome to 2403 in Lamar State College Orange, second half of Anatomy and Physiology 2. Welcome. We will continue on through A&P1. I did want to let you know that you can use your settings within your Blackboard, and hopefully you used your Blackboard in your Anatomy 1. Um, You can use your information and your content in this particular course. I have your examinations set up in your content. They won't be opened up until it's time to take the exams. Um, the information page you'll see has my uh, syllabus in it. It has my office hours. It has some study guide tips in there. I also have access to my Mastering A&P as well as our pathology paper assignment, which is an extra credit. It is an optional assignment for you. It does end up adding several points to your overall grade. So if you do that, then you do have the possibility, if you're on the borderline of the letter grade or a letter grade, this will bring you up to that next letter grade. Congratulations, if you've taken A&P1, you have made it through. And we're going to now take you forward into looking at some of the information. Looking at the information on the exam 1, please make sure that you look at Larry Wilmore's notes for biology 2. I believe the last ones are from 2016. That does use this particular textbook. Again, others can be used to even pass. Anatomy and physiology has not changed that much. Again, these are not complete notes, exhaustive notes. These are more of an outline. It does have a lot of information in it. It keeps you having to write copious notes. Again, we'll cover more information on our first particular class. And looking at the exam information for 1, which will cover blood and heart, please make sure that you use this video to go back and look at notes. And one of the topics, and I'm not going to give you certainly individual questions, but I am going to narrow down the information for you so that you can better study along the way instead of trying to cram in the last couple of hours before an exam. You does not have good results in taking anatomy and physiology. I do not use PowerPoints. I do use lecture. Gives you good reason to come to class, but it's always nice to know this information before you at least what you're going to be asked. All right, looking back at exam 1, make sure you know your heart anatomy. Make sure you know your chambers. Make sure you know your vascular system. Know the arteries, know the veins, know the pulmonary system as it relates to the heart. Again, my examinations are heavily laboratory based, which means they're very structural based. So if you do well and study well in laboratory, you've got a lot better chance of doing well. I will ask physiology questions along the way, but again, please don't discount laboratory. It is 25% of your total grade. Plus, again, it is very heavily weighted in my particular examinations. Make sure you know your EKG waves. Make sure you know what the P wave is. Make sure you know what your T wave, your QRS. Make sure you know each one of those blips and curves that you see on an EKG. We will, again, cover this in class, but just going over that. Make sure you know your vocabulary, heavily stressed vocabulary, and your terms. You can't do this field if you don't know the language. So please make sure that you study vocabulary. I'll talk about it a lot in lecture. Again, as you know about, hopefully you know already in A&P2, this is a very descriptive field. So it describes what it is, how big it is, and usually what's going on. So if you know your vocabulary, you'll do much better than most who decide not to study that. All right. Know what a myocardial infarction is. Know the difference between pericarditis as well as angina pectoris. Know your different terms as we cover each one of these in class. I do have some flow questions, so make sure you can follow a drop of blood from where it enters the heart through the vena cavas and to the right atrium, and then follow it as it passes all the way through the heart to the lungs, back to the heart, and eventually to the rest of the body. I do have questions asking about the structures of the heart. So again, know your chambers, know your valves, know the reasons for those valves and their purpose. So again, they're not just placeholders. They're not just things that they put on a heart and say, hey, you need to learn these. They have a reason for that. Remember, that's the physiology as the function of the structure. So we're going to study both of those. Know what a hemorrhage is. Terminology anyway, and then know how that affects the output of the heart. I have several direct pictures from your textbook from the heart looking for specific structures, and every one of these we will cover in class. I'm looking at 4 or 5 of these here on the exam. I think I have one EKG on this particular exam. Very, very basic. Later on in laboratory, we will talk about EKGs in much greater detail. But in your textbook, you do have an EKG, and it talks about some abnormal as well as normal sinus rhythms, and that is a good term to know. Sinus rhythm as well as abnormals, and we'll talk about each one of those again. Congestive heart failures, there are 2 different types of congestive heart failures. We'll talk about those. Make sure you know which one, the right and the left side. Talk about the pulmonary arteries, the pulmonary veins. Kind of goes back to flow. Make sure you understand your flow. Another EKG, not only knowing what EKG stands for, but as well as why we use it, what's the advantage of using EKG versus other types of diagnostic tests. We talk about hematocrit quite a bit in this particular chapter. You need to know what a hematocrit is, but you need to know how to calculate it. And we talk about that in laboratory, especially for your first lab exam. We'll talk about hematocrit, how to calculate that, and you actually will calculate that. We'll discuss that and do measurements in laboratory. So that'll back up the lecture. Know what can cause someone's hematocrit to rise, to increase, to be for the blood to be more thick, the blood to be less thick. Again, hematocrit increase and decrease. Several different reasons for that to happen. Again, more hematocrit questions asking why someone's hematocrit might rise and why someone's hematocrit might lower. We do talk about the different blood types of white blood cells. We will talk about red blood cells. We'll talk about platelets. We will talk about the white blood cells. There are 5 different types of white blood cells. They're divided into formed and unformed, and then they subcategorize off of that. Some are nucleated, some are anucleated. They have each one of those have characteristics as far as the types of blood cells. In the particular white blood cells, the differential counts, they'll all have different percentage of each one of those white blood cells. So make sure you know your count, your differential percentages. We'll talk primarily of the ABO, just the blood types A, B, and O. In laboratory and later on in the classes, we will talk about your positives and your negatives. Erythrocyte, as you will know, is a red blood cell. I want you to know where that is, what hormone dictates that. I want you to know where that's made. I want you to know why someone's red blood cell production may go up, why it may go down. In white blood cell, sending white blood cells, and you'll find that they fight different types of infections. I want you to know the different terms for that. How does the white blood cell leave? What causes the white blood cell to leave the vascular system to go fight that in particular infection? Several more questions on the migration of white blood cells, why that happens. Another couple of questions on red blood cells, again, going back to its origin, going back why that's even necessary. different types of granulocyte and agranular. Kind of goes back to your white blood cells. Again, characteristics for each one. Are 5 different ones there. Another hematocrit questions, a couple of them here. Talk about what influences heart rate. I have a question on that. So we'll talk about heart disease. We'll talk about heart rate. We'll talk about different types of problems and pathologies that we will have with the heart, which ones are influenced by genetics, which ones are not. A couple of blood flow questions. Again, being able to track a drop of blood from point A to point B. A couple of matching questions in this particular exam. They are structure and physiology flow questions, as well as it pertains to each of the structures. Different layers of the heart. Just one second. A couple of more pictures of the heart. An EKG. Know the different types of structures that one might see on an EKG. Particularly, we mentioned about what the P wave is, the T wave, the QRS, and why they are happening not only on the screen, but what's influencing that particular blip on the screen. We'll talk about calculating heart rate through that. We talk about the not only the physical structures of the heart, but the electrical flow of the heart. That electrical flow has several structures in it, and we will talk about the different flow, just like we do vascular flow. Several pictures on that. Again, laboratory will cover this in greater detail later on in the semester, but in the first several chapters of this textbook of the second semester, we'll cover the very same thing. In particular, SA node, AV node, bundle of His, Purkinje fibers, just to throw out some terms for you. Understand what ventricular filling is. Understand why heart, what's happening at different phases of the heart. Talk about heart blocks. Know the difference between a vascular and an electrical heart block. Talk about different types of muscles. There are 3 different types of muscles, skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. And as you can tell, we're talking about cardiac. So make sure you know the physical characteristics of that. Going back into flow again for the heart. So make sure you know your blood flow. Understand the difference between systolic and diastolic phases of a heartbeat. EPO, erythropoietin, we talk considerable amounts on it. Please make sure you know what EPO is, understand where it is made, understand its influence on the heart. pH range. That's a pretty specific question. We talk about the different structures and where, in another question, we talk about where these cells are made, red blood cells, white blood cells. We talk about where they end up after their usable life is up. Where do they go from there? In lecture, in particular, we talk about the phases of blood clotting. So we'll mention each one of those. We have several pathologies. You'll come to learn that I like pathology. Pathology is really only understood once you understand everything else that we've been talking about in class. So I do typically ask a lot of pathology or disease questions, and they're not difficult once you know the information. All right, there are some actual photographs of different types of blood determination of blood types. We'll talk about these. Make sure you know the difference between an antigen and an antibody. In laboratory later on this semester, we will actually do a laboratory exam where we will determine your blood type, whether you're an A type, a B, AB, O. Those all can be determined, and you'll get a chance to do that. Some of you may already know your blood type, others may not. And on this first exam, I have several examples of pictures and to determine someone's blood type based on that laboratory exam. Several questions in a row on the white blood cells. Again, know there are 5 different types. Make sure you know their physical characteristics. Your first laboratory exam will be identifying those on a laboratory exam sheet by picture, by photograph, and also by clinically looking through a microscope. You'll enjoy AMP2 much, much better, particularly in the laboratories. Several terms about moving white blood cells out of the vascular system into the tissues. Make sure you understand those particular terms. The 5 white blood cells all have different functions. Some of them determine or increased rather when you have a bacterial infection. Some are increased when you have a viral, some with parasitic, some with allergies, and other combinations of types of illness, so viruses and such. So please make sure that you know the 5 blood cell types. Make sure that you know which ones they particularly increase so they fight those particular diseases. We talk about deficiencies and again, pathology is one of those, is pernicious anemia. Different types of anemia. You'll learn to find out what anemia is. There's plastic, aplastic, polycythemia. Anemias are 2 types, particularly iron deficient and pernicious. We'll talk about both of those. All right, so I hope that helps a little bit. Use this time as a study guide. And I'm looking forward to, again, seeing you in class. By the time you see this, you may have already been in class. But again, over that first week or so, we'll take an exam about every week or so. We'll have 4 exams. And again, we'll cover all of that in the syllabus when you get to class. Hopefully this has been helpful. And again, ask questions in class. I can't answer questions unless you ask them.